several sheets for gold and Boston.
That's wonderful. Not cherry instead of a mangled white thing.
We have to make the pillowcases because they are out of pillowcases.
We have to make them?
What do you mean make them? This family knows how to make anything.
Let's turn the camera off. We filmed enough.
2 sheets so I can make more pillowcases.
Well, that's, what is it, 2
Turn it off,
sets?
Mommy.
No.
No, it's one set, but I got an extra flat sheet so we could, because they were out of the pillowcases, and we'll just make the pillowcases.
Okay.
Wow, thank you. That's a great one.
Maybe next year we can make some.
Here, turn off the camera. We filmed enough. You can sit down and relax. That's there.
Yeah, I really like that. It's far away, you can't really tell it's cut up.
I can't tell it's cut up. It's beautiful.
What do you think that is, Patrick?
It's an Xbox controller, no doubt.
How could it
The
be?
frame thing needs like help because somehow the thing came off and it didn't stay.
One thing.
Well, you will never see the back.
You made a rip the whole thing.
What is it?
It's an Xbox controller.
Elizabeth, you got the wrong kind of controller.
What?
You got the wrong kind of controller.
What are you talking about?
Open it up. Let's see what it really is.
Yay. Wow. You got a controller.
And next Christmas, we're going to get the rest of the thing.
That only means one thing. Yes! Thank you, Daddy. Awesome. It's so big. Thank you, Daddy. This is awesome.
Well, thank your mother, too. Thank your sister. She got the wrong controller, then we had to buy the rest. I think she was trying to upgrade us.
Well, it came last night. We don't know where it's gone on the packaging. Yes, I thought they were very with
Now,
you can see how they flare at the bottom. They're not
Just
tapered.
flare it all at the bottom of her.
Well, they're not tapered. Like them.
Yeah.
If you don't like them, that's no problem either.
I've cut
Oh, I
myself.
know what this is. What? It's chocolate.
Let's.
Yes, very romantic. Truffle's my favorite flavor.
Do we have one now?
I never get my own chocolate.
We already bought it for our family.
I did not. You bought it for me. Because it's a romantic gift. You can't have many.
What? You can't have money.
Patrick's getting out the first aid kit now?
I cut my finger and there's no band-aids. I mean, this house doesn't have a band-aid.
You figure you're too old for Band-Aids.
So that's funny. I buy Band-Aids and then everyone uses them up. Like, I think when you use a Band-Aid, you use about 14.
What are you talking about?
Yeah, the cultural stuff. Well, not really, yeah. We haven't sung so far down, we're not aware of it.
Adam, where's your mommy? Can we say he was?
He's coming right along. He's just got the whole concentration focus. He's got his real musical ability, I think.
Yeah, she's better.
So, Underground is a very interesting composer. He uses a technique that's called bitonality, which combines two harmonies that don't really belong together. But he makes it work. For instance, in the beginning, the piano has, the first two notes that the piano has are very harmonious together. The next two notes that the piano has are also very harmonious together. But those two notes have nothing to do harmonically with the first two notes. And then the flute comes in with something totally different that has nothing to do with either of those two.
Eduard Balo was a French composer, but he was sort of a Spanish composer because his family was originally Spanish. And he was born in 1823, and he lived till the end of the century. And he also went to the Paris Conservatory as a composer. And he first became famous for like his songs that he wrote for voice, and he also wrote some operas. And his most famous piece, though, was his Symphony Espagnole for violin and orchestra. And this piece has like a rather Spanish sound to it, as you see, even though it's not called anything Spanish. And it was written in 1876 and performed in 1877.
instrument. The predecessor was a very simple, almost primitive instrument. It was made of wood, and in the beginning it had no keys at all. In the Renaissance, it didn't have no keys, and then the Baroque period it had one key, and then gradually it added more keys towards the end of the 18th century. It had 8 keys, but then created a whole other system which allowed the flute to do many, many more things than it had ever done before. And having created this wonderful new invention, he then wanted to show it off. And so he wrote all sorts of compositions which showed off all the different things that this new instrument could do. And this is a set of variations on a theme called Nel Cor Nu, which came from an opera, an Italian opera. And I'm guessing that it was very popular at the time, and it was almost this kind of thing where, people would go around humming some of the melodies from the opera. So it was well known, and he took this well-known melody, and first he wrote a very romantic introduction to it, what in my family we would call schmaltzy. And then he introduces the theme as it came straight from the opera. And then he proceeds to explore both the inherent qualities in the theme in a set of 6 variations, as well as all the magical, wonderful things that this new instrument could do. And so this will be our closing piece for the afternoon, and we thank you all for being here. It's been a pleasure to play for you and to meet a new colleague and to hear such wonderful cello players from such useful musicians. Thank you.